So chances are you're watching this video because you're either interested in buying your first home or perhaps even your second home. Either way, I think it's a great idea to share tips on buying your first home, but a lot of these tips can apply to even buying your second home as well. But before getting any further in this video, I did want to share one interesting fact about real estate. The original housewarming party was actually people bringing firewood to homes to actually warm up their house, and that's where the term housewarming party comes from. If you found that fact interesting, please hit that like button for me just to show appreciation for that fact, or at least for this video in general. But if you didn't find that interesting, that's okay too. I'm still going to share my tips on buying your first home. Now I'm going to start with the tip that I think is actually the most unusual, or at least the one that I don't hear too often. Now this is going to sound a little bit extreme, but just bear with me. I think it's a great idea if you're about to put in your final offer for the home you're really interested in. It's probably a good idea to scope out that home and actually go to that home and visit it at the time that you typically be going to work, so that way you can get a good sense of the idea of what the traffic is like in that area. Just think about it this way: going to work is probably one of the most common things you're going to do in your day-to-day life, and on top of that, sitting in traffic can actually ruin or make you miserable day to day. So if you visit a home and you realize that there's a lot of traffic in that particular area, or maybe you realize that the street doesn't really have great access to a highway or a particular intersection, then it may be a great idea to at least postpone writing a final offer. And here's the thing: just a couple of streets or a couple of blocks down the road, you can actually find an equivalent home that actually may have just slightly better access, or even significantly better access. So that's why I think it's a really good idea to scope out the area to see if there's any traffic in that area and how it actually impacts your day-to-day travel or commute. And while you're scoping this out, I kind of think it's a great idea too to just kind of get a general sense of the most common places you're going to visit and what the traffic is like towards that certain area. For example, look at the grocery store you typically go to, what that commute would be like, because that's something you're going to be doing every single day. Just kidding, you shouldn't necessarily be going to the grocery store every single day, and if you are, that's probably a problem you want to handle right away. Now the next tip is to talk to others, whether it be friends, family, or coworkers, or anybody you might know that has actually gone through the home buying process themselves, and ask them if they have, what their experience was like and if they have any tips. The way I see it, it pretty much never hurts you to have more information and more stories and experiences, and you can also adjust that to your own personal preferences, because obviously no one's going to be quite like you as far as what they value, so you can kind of adjust accordingly when you hear people's experience as well as their mistakes. And for me personally, I tend to be a data or an analytical type person, so I'm actually going to get a whole bunch of experiences out there and talk to a whole bunch of different people, rather than just have one or two different people, because then you end up relying on those certain experiences really heavily, when what they're saying may not actually be as accurate as they're making it out to be. You see, what I would recommend is go out there and just in your general area, ask people their experience and see the different negatives that they're all talking about. See if there's any kind of trend or commonalities that are shared between the different experiences. If everybody's talking about living in a certain area and how there's a lot more maintenance than they expected, then there's probably a good reason to it. Maybe the homes in that area are actually a lot older than what we were expecting. But then once again, you still kind of have to adjust this to your own experience, because perhaps you're really good with your hands and you're really good at do-it-yourself type projects. So in that case, then this significant data point that everybody's sharing about isn't necessarily as relevant to your personal life. The other thing I would highly suggest when it comes to talking about other people's experiences is to really understand the why. You go up to different people and they talk about how they didn't necessarily put 20% down on their home. Maybe that's not actually the best financial move for you to do. And so you begin to ask people, why did they do that? And they explain that the only way they could qualify for a home was going through an FHA loan because they had bad credit or something like that. And then because you have good credit, then it doesn't necessarily actually fit your situation to not put 20% down. And as much as we may not necessarily like to, typically parents and close friends are a really good example and a great resource to talk to as far as the first time home buying experience, because not only have some of these people gone through it, in some cases even several times, especially if your parents are a little bit older and they've bought 2 or 3 homes in their lifetime, they have a lot of knowledge in that area. But on top of that, your friends and family are typically people that understand you at least half decently well. And so then they can, tailor the advice that they're going to give to you in a way that you're going to understand best. Just an example, maybe your family is really aware of how you tend to make hasty decisions. So they're going to give really great advice as far as how to slow down the home buying experience and taking your time with that. The one catch to all of this, though, is that when you take advice from friends and family, especially if they're close to you, then you kind of feel like you owe it to them to take their advice. So for example, if you have a parent out there that suggests, you really should only buy a 1-story home, but maybe you have different plans in mind that they're not necessarily aware of. Maybe you're planning on expanding your family and having a few kids, so it actually does make sense to have a 2-story home, but you don't necessarily want to cause an argument or anything like that. So then, it ends up kind putting this pressure as far as the home buying process. But at the end of the day, what you really have to realize, especially when you're taking advice from other people, is that at the end of the day, this is a decision you're going to have to live with, not necessarily someone else. And on top of that, the other thing I don't necessarily think people realize too much is that you're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on a home, maybe not necessarily right away, because most people end up thinking about in terms of monthly payments. So you're only paying $1,000 per month or whatever your mortgage ends up being. And so then you don't necessarily feel like it's a huge financial decision. But once you do realize that at the end of the mortgage, you have spent, typically hundreds of thousands of dollars on this decision, then it's really a decision that you need to take ownership for, not necessarily rely on other people's experience. Now, the next tip I would share here is to really understand what you actually value and don't value when it comes to buying a home. Now, this is a little bit tricky because pretty much everybody out there that has bought their first home ends up going into the process thinking they value certain things or certain rooms. For example, they really want to have a guest room, but then after they actually buy their first home, they realize that certain things that they thought they cared about, they don't necessarily care about too much. I'll give a good example about this. It was always one of my goals to have, a really full grown garden out there, to grow my own fruits and vegetables. But once I actually started to try to grow my own garden, I realized that it's actually a lot more difficult than I thought. So I ended up buying a home with a pretty big yard so that way I could have my own garden. But now, on my second home, maybe I might actually reconsider. A good example of this that I often see is, for example, being interested in having a game room or something like that, and not necessarily fully realizing that a good high-quality ping pong table is actually a lot more expensive than you think, or that a pool table is really difficult to move and is actually a little bit impractical. And so you're not necessarily doing the full amount of research to really understand the features of a home that you actually care about. And on top of that, I see a lot of people that buy certain rooms or certain features in their home because they think it's going to change their day-to-day life. For example, buying a gym room is not necessarily going to make you work out any more than you already do, especially if it's something that you're not that interested in. So the solution to all this that I would suggest is to go out there and visit a lot of homes and see the different things that are really common or things that you might actually care about and kind of play around with it a little bit. Walk around the kitchen. Don't necessarily just look at the kitchen for 5 seconds and think, all right, this kitchen fits my needs. Walk around, pretend in a way that you're actually cooking in the kitchen, and then you might actually start to notice certain things. You open up the dishwasher and realize, well, when the dishwasher's open, the fridge can't open at the same time. This is actually a bit of a problem. You have to understand from the realtor's perspective that they're trying to push a volume of homes as quickly as possible. So they're not necessarily trying to have the tedious process of doing home showings take, 3 to 4 hours. They want to get that down to 1 hour or even 30 minutes. And so a lot of people that are being shown a home for the first time are actually kind of surprised about how quick they walk through the home. What you have to understand is you are in control of the home buying process because ultimately you're the one that's actually going to be buying the home. So if you want to take 3 to 4 hours to explore home, I think everybody should, especially because you consider that it's kind of ridiculous to just think that you're going to spend 1 or 2 hours and just do a walkthrough through the home in a place that you're going to end up spending, 15 or 20 years of the rest of your life in. But back to this idea as far as buying rooms and thinking it's going to change your day-to-day life, what I would at least suggest to a lot of people is kind of take a hard evaluation as far as the past year and see if there's anything that's actually been consistent as far as something you actually been wanting in your life. For example, if you really have been wanting a gym room and you actually have a makeshift gym room of your own, maybe you set it up in the kitchen or something in your apartment, and so then when you're buying your home, that actually may be a valid reason to buy a house that actually has a space for a homemade gym. Now, here's another tip that I actually do see that is fairly common, but I want to emphasize it here, and that's to really evaluate your neighbors and the neighborhood in general. Chances are, if you've only lived in an apartment, you're typically only living in an apartment for 1 to 2 years before you move on to the next apartment, so you actually haven't had a neighbor that you had to deal with over 5 to 10 years. When it comes to buying a home, if your neighbor has a dog and you're being shown a home and the dog starts to bark a little bit, and it just kind of seems like a minor annoyance, just very slightly, it's not really that big of a deal, you have to understand the actual scope as far as a time frame. It may be a minor annoyance now, but over the course of 30 years, it actually may turn out to be a pretty big deal. Really take this suggestion seriously and look at your neighbors' houses, see how well their yard is kept up. Maybe even inspect their cars just a little bit, not necessarily go right up to their cars or anything like that, but if their cars are not necessarily well maintained, that's kind of an indication that maybe they're not necessarily organized, or maybe they don't necessarily have the time to invest in upkeeping things. So then that will actually translate into not necessarily being able to upkeep their home, which when you're a homeowner, you tend to care a lot more about upkeep of other people's homes, because then it actually impacts the home value of your own home, which is a valuable asset to a lot of people. And I don't necessarily just mean the neighbors directly right next to the house that you're interested in. Go take take a walk around, walk around the neighborhood, also see the neighbors' houses that are, 5 or 6 or even, a whole entire block down the road, because those are neighbors that you actually may end up caring about as well. There's this home that's quite a few houses down the road from me, but I tend to end up walking around the neighborhood on occasion on the afternoons, and what ends up happening when I walk past this home is that they have a few dogs. And this wouldn't necessarily be a problem or anything, but the problem is that they don't necessarily keep their dogs on a leash, or there's not necessarily a fenced-in area. So when I walk past the house, the dogs end up kind of following me for a while, and I don't necessarily like that, because it makes me nervous that the dogs may do something to me, or maybe the dogs may get lost or something like that, and I would feel guilty for that. So it ends up kind of being a pretty big inconvenience for me, especially because I end up walking around the neighborhood quite often. So that's kind of what I mean as far as viewing the neighborhood and actually really evaluating on what are the things you're going to care about, not necessarily immediately, but are things that are going to kind of fester over the years and things that would be significant. Now, at the same time, back to that whole dog example, those are things at the same time that I couldn't necessarily predict. I couldn't necessarily scope out that neighbor's house, for hours on hours and end before I put in a final offer for my home. The whole entire home buying process, as far as the first time home buying process, tends to end up being filled with mistakes, and it's kind of a bit of a learning curve. So it's okay that you're going to make these mistakes, because at the end of the day, what's most important is that you actually learn from these mistakes, so that way the next time you go to buy a home, you're in a better position. And to really stick to my point as far as learning from others, if you have any of your own tips as far as your first time home buying experience, or things that you've heard other people share, go ahead and comment down below. I'm be curious what other people's kind of first major tip that they would share, as far as if you were only to give one tip to a first-time home buyer, what is the one tip that you actually give them? So that's it for this video. If you appreciate this video at all, please give it a big thumbs up. It'd mean more than a lot to me. And if you like personal finance, business, economics, or anything like that, please hit that subscribe button to stay tuned for more.